The spotlight didn't just find Leif Garrett, it swallowed him. Before the screaming fans, before the magazine covers, before the carefully crafted image of the golden-haired teen idol, there was a child trying to understand why love at home felt conditional and success felt like survival. Hollywood loves the myth of overnight fame. It rarely tells the truth about what that fame costs, especially when it arrived before adulthood. For Leif Garrett, childhood and celebrity did not run side by side. They collided, and when they did, something fragile was left behind. He didn't grow into fame. He was placed inside it. Cameras turned toward him before he had learned who he was. Decisions were made around him before he understood their consequences. And applause, loud, intoxicating, constant, became the language that replaced reassurance. But behind the posters on teenage bedroom walls, behind the bright television appearances, behind the carefully styled hair and effortless smile, a quieter reality unfolded. A family dynamic that was complicated, fractured, and far from the supportive foundation the public assumed existed. Because success in Hollywood often creates the illusion of unity, it suggests that behind every rising star stands a cheering household. But sometimes the opposite is true. Sometimes fame magnifies tension. Sometimes it deepens distance. Sometimes it exposes cracks that were already there. For Leif Garrett, those cracks appeared early. He was surrounded by ambition before he was surrounded by understanding. The industry saw potential. Executives saw profit. Managers saw opportunity. But the emotional scaffolding that might have steadied him never fully formed. The pressure to perform did not begin on stage. It began at home. Expectations were unspoken but unmistakable. Success wasn't just encouraged. It became necessary. Every role mattered. Every appearance mattered. Every decision carried weight far beyond what a young teenager should ever carry. And when childhood becomes responsibility, innocence disappears quietly. Leif learned quickly that approval came with achievement. The louder the applause, the more valuable he felt. The more fans screamed his name, the more the uncertainty inside him temporarily faded. But applause is temporary, and when it fades, the silence can be overwhelming. By the late 1970s, he was everywhere. Magazine covers, television interviews, sold-out concerts, teen idol status at its peak. His image became synonymous with youth, charm, and effortless charisma. To the world, he looked like he had everything. But fame is a performance, and performances end. Behind closed doors, exhaustion accumulated, identity blurred. The line between who he was and who the industry wanted him to be became increasingly difficult to see. And without strong emotional grounding, the pressure intensified. Hollywood moved fast, too fast. Schedules filled every hour. Recording sessions bled into promotional tours. Acting roles overlapped with concerts. Decisions were made quickly, often without pause, reflection, or emotional consideration. The machine kept moving, and Leif Garrett was expected to keep up. The problem with constant motion is that it leaves no space for self-discovery. He wasn't just working. He was being shaped, molded into an image that sold records and tickets. The carefree teen idol, the charming rebel, the approachable superstar. Each version constructed carefully, marketed strategically, and reinforced repeatedly. But none of those versions answered a simple question. Who was he when the camera stopped? Without that answer, the internal pressure grew. And when pressure builds without release, it looks for escape. The late nights became more frequent, the expectations heavier, the sense of isolation deeper. Fame surrounded him with people, but emotional support remained elusive. The difference between being admired and being understood became painfully clear. He was seen everywhere, but rarely truly seen. The industry continued forward, as it always does. New faces emerged. Trends shifted. The teen idol wave evolved. And as the spotlight slowly adjusted, Leif Garrett found himself navigating a transition that many young stars never fully prepare for. What happens after peak? For some, this transition is gradual. For others, it is abrupt. For him, it felt like both. Public perception changed. Media narratives shifted. The same outlets that once celebrated him began analyzing him, scrutinizing him, questioning him. And without a stable personal foundation, those shifts felt deeply personal. The family support that might have cushioned the fall remained inconsistent. Expectation still lingered, but reassurance remained scarce. Success had once been the language of connection. Now, uncertainty replaced it. And uncertainty is difficult to navigate alone. Mistakes followed, some public, some private, some misunderstood, some deeply human, each one magnified by fame, each one analyzed by audiences who saw only fragments of a larger story. The narrative became simplified, as Hollywood narratives often are. But real lives are not simple. Behind every headline, there was a young man still searching for identity. Behind every criticism, there was someone still trying to understand where he belonged. And behind every setback, there was a quiet realization that fame does not replace support, it only masks its absence. Years passed, the spotlight softened, the noise faded, and with distance came perspective. Leif Garrett began speaking not as a teen idol, not as a headline, but as someone who had lived through the machinery of fame and survived its emotional aftermath. He reflected on expectations, on pressure, on the complicated relationship between family and success. He didn't speak with anger. He spoke with clarity, because time changes memory. It softens edges. It reveals patterns. It transformed confusion into understanding. He began to recognize that support is not measured by proximity. It is measured by presence. And presence had often been missing when he needed it most. Still, survival itself became a form of strength. He rebuilt quietly, step by step, not chasing the same spotlight, but redefining success in more personal terms. Healing replaced performance. Reflection replaced reaction. Understanding replaced resentment. The journey did not erase the past, but it reframed it. Because resilience is not about forgetting. It is about integrating experience into identity. And as Leif Garrett moved forward, his story evolved from one of teen idol fame to something deeper, a story about endurance, self-discovery, and the long path toward emotional independence. Hollywood continues to celebrate youth. It continues to produce stars. It continues to tell simplified narratives. But behind those narratives are lives shaped by pressure, expectation, and the complicated dynamics of family and fame. Leif Garrett's story stands as a reminder of what the spotlight hides. Not just success, not just struggle, but the human reality in between. A child placed into fame before understanding himself. A young man searching for stability in a world built on image. And ultimately, an adult finding clarity in the quiet space after the noise. The camera pulls back. The applause fades. The stage empties. And what remains is not the poster, not the headline, not the myth, but a person who survived both fame and its absence. Because sometimes the most powerful comeback is not returning to the spotlight. It is finally stepping out of the shadow it cast. The quiet after fame can feel heavier than the noise that came before it. For Leif Garrett, that silence did not arrive suddenly. It crept in slowly, replacing packed schedules with empty calendars, replacing constant validation with long moments of reflection. When the spotlight fades, identity becomes the loudest question in the room. 4 years, he had been introduced by labels, teen idol, heartthrob, chart topper, television star. Those words carried weight, but they also carried distance from who he truly was. When those labels began to fall away, something unexpected emerged, uncertainty, but also possibility. The industry had taught him how to perform. Life now asked him how to exist without performing. He began revisiting memories that once felt too complicated to process. The early auditions, the long recording sessions, the endless interviews where he smiled even when exhaustion pulled at him. He remembered the expectations that shaped his decisions, expectations that often came from outside, but sometimes from inside as well. Because when a young person learns that approval follows success, the need to succeed becomes deeply personal. He realized how often he had measured himself against public reaction. A hit song meant confidence. A quiet period meant doubt. That cycle, repeated over years, created an emotional dependency that was difficult to break. But breaking it became necessary. Gradually, he stepped away from the idea that worth had to be proven in front of an audience. That shift did not happen overnight. It came through setbacks, reflection, and the slow rebuilding of trust in himself. He began choosing smaller projects, creative efforts that felt authentic rather than strategic. The pressure to reclaim former glory faded, replaced by a quieter goal, stability. And stability, unlike fame, grows slowly. He also began speaking more openly about the reality of child stardom, not with bitterness, but with honesty. He described how early success can blur boundaries, how families sometimes struggle to balance ambition with protection, and how the industry often rewards productivity more than well-being. His words resonated because they carried lived experience. People who once saw him as an icon began to see him as a voice, someone who understood both the glamour and the cost. Interviews shifted tone. Conversations became reflective rather than sensational. The narrative softened. Time continued forward, as it always does. Generations changed. New stars emerged. The cultural memory of his peak years became history. Yet his story remained relevant because it mirrored a pattern seen repeatedly in entertainment. Young fame, immense pressure, public scrutiny, personal rebuilding. But unlike many stories that end in tragedy, his evolved into resilience. He began to redefine success not as visibility, but as balance. Relationships regained importance. Personal growth replaced external achievement. The need to prove himself diminished. And with that, a sense of calm slowly replaced the chaos of earlier years. There is something powerful about survival in an industry that often moves on quickly. It means learning to exist beyond relevant cycles. It means finding identity outside of public opinion. It means understanding that fame is temporary, but self-understanding can endure. Leif Garrett's journey reflects that transformation. The posters may fade. The charts may change. The headlines may disappear. But the human story remains, layered, complex, and shaped by experience. He no longer needed the stage to define him. The applause had served its purpose. Now, reflection carried more meaning than recognition. And in that quiet evolution, something unexpected happened. The boy who once searched for approval became a man who understood himself. The camera drifts away from the flashing lights of the past. The noise dissolves into memory. And what remains is not a fallen idol, but a survivor of fame's brightest glare. Because sometimes the most enduring legacy is not the height of success, but the strength it takes to rebuild when the spotlight finally moves on. The passage of time did something the spotlight never allowed. It gave Leif Garrett distance from the noise that once defined him. Hourglass with flowing sand distance, in this case, became clarity. He began to see his life not as a sequence of dramatic highs and lows, but as a continuum shaped by forces that started long before fame arrived. Childhood expectations, industry pressure, public fascination, personal confusion, each piece connected, forming a story that was never as simple as success or struggle alone. The world had watched the rise. It had also watched the fall. But very few had witnessed the rebuilding, the slow, deliberate work that happens away from cameras. Rebuilding meant redefining relationships. Some connections faded naturally as the industry moved on. Others strengthened, grounded not in fame but in authenticity. He learned to recognize the difference between those who value the image and those who value the person behind it. That distinction changed everything. For the first time, conversations were not about career moves or chart positions. They were about life, about perspective, about lessons learned the hard way. The absence of pressure created space for honesty, and honesty created space for healing. He also began to revisit creativity in a different way. Music was no longer a product designed for mass appeal. It became expression. Acting was no longer about maintaining relevance. It became exploration. The stakes were lower, but the meaning was deeper. There is a quiet freedom that comes when performance is no longer tied to identity. He discovered that he could create without needing validation. That realization, simple on the surface, represented profound shift from his earlier years. No longer chasing applause, he began appreciating the process itself. The craft, the storytelling, the emotional connection. And in that shift, confidence slowly returned. Not the flashy confidence of youth, but a grounded assurance built on experience. He understood his past. He accepted its complications. And he used those lessons as a foundation rather than a burden. Meanwhile, the public perception of him continued to evolve. People who once remembered only the teen idol began to recognize the survivor. Interviews took on a reflective tone. Documentaries revisited his story with nuance rather than sensationalism. The narrative matured, just as he had. He spoke candidly about the emotional cost of early fame, not to assign blame, but to provide insight. He acknowledged the complexity of family dynamics, the confusion of sudden success, and the difficulty of growing up under constant observation. His story became a cautionary tale, but also a hopeful one, because it demonstrated that recovery is possible, that identity can be rebuilt, that life after fame can hold meaning beyond nostalgia. Years passed, and the intensity of the past softened further. Memories that once felt painful became instructive. Regret transformed into understanding, and the urgency to rewrite history faded, replaced by acceptance. He no longer needed to reclaim what was lost. He focused instead on appreciating what remained: experience, resilience, and perspective. The industry continued to cycle through new stars, new trends, new headlines. But his story stood apart because it reflected endurance. He had lived through the machinery of celebrity and emerged with self-awareness intact. That alone was remarkable. As he looked back, he understood that fame had never truly defined him. It had shaped him, challenged him, and at times overwhelmed him, but it had not determined his core identity. That identity, he realized, had always been evolving beneath the surface. The young boy searching for approval had grown into someone capable of offering himself the understanding he once sought from others. And perhaps that was the most significant transformation of all. The lights that once followed him now belonged to another generation. The stage that once felt like home became just one chapter in a larger story. Yet the lessons learned under that glare remained valuable. He had discovered that success without support can feel empty, that applause without understanding can feel isolating, and that rebuilding, though difficult, can lead to a deeper sense of self. The narrative did not end with triumph or tragedy. It settled into something quieter: reflection. The camera pulls back once more. The crowd is gone. The noise has faded into history. But the story continues, not as spectacle, but as life lived beyond the spotlight. Because sometimes the most powerful legacy is not the fame itself, but the wisdom gained after learning how to live without it. Time continued to move forward, and with it, the story of Leif Garrett transformed from a tale of fame into something far more human, a journey of endurance, perspective, and quiet reinvention. Clapperboard. There comes a moment in every life shaped by public attention when the individual must decide whether to chase the past or redefine the future. For years, the temptation to reclaim what once existed lingered in the background. The memory of sold-out concerts, screaming fans, and constant recognition was difficult to ignore. But chasing that memory would have meant living in comparison, and comparison rarely leads to peace. Instead, he began focusing on something more sustainable: personal stability. The transition was subtle. Daily routines replaced chaotic schedules. Conversations became deeper. Reflection replaced reaction. These small shifts might have seemed insignificant from the outside, but internally they represented profound change. He was no longer reacting to the momentum of fame. He was choosing direction deliberately, and that choice created space for growth. He revisited old recordings, not with regret, but with curiosity. He saw a young performer working tirelessly to meet expectations, and instead of judging that version of himself, he felt empathy. That empathy extended inward. The harsh self-criticism that once dominated his thoughts softened. He recognized that he had done the best he could with the tools he had at the time. Understanding replaced blame. He also recognized how fame had accelerated his life. Experiences that most people encounter gradually, independence, pressure, identity formation, had all arrived at once. Without the benefit of time, those experiences had been overwhelming. But now, with maturity, he could process them at his own pace. That slower pace became healing. The world outside continued changing. Entertainment evolved. Social media reshaped celebrity culture. Younger audiences discovered him not through posters or vinyl records, but through documentaries, interviews, and retrospective discussions. To them, he wasn't just a teen idol. He was part of a larger narrative about fame and its consequences. This new perspective reshaped his place in cultural memory. He became less of a symbol of youth and more of a symbol of resilience. People listened differently. They heard not just nostalgia, but insight. His experiences offered context for conversations about mental health, childhood stardom, and the importance of support systems. In a way,